It can be very difficult for children and teens to go through family disruptions. They're watching it. Like, you can do your best to hide all those things, but they know.
Yeah.
And their friends find out about it. And for kids and teens, it's hard to navigate through that because it's not any choices they made, but they're having to live with processing a lot of the fallout.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Welcome back to the Jesus in the Upper Left podcast. My name is Pete Armstrong, and I'm the pastor here at Park Lane. I work with Shalom Rockwood in our community. This is my co-host, Oshua Hawthorne. What are you up to, man?
Yeah, what's up, B? Hey.
Hey. And then today we have Jamie Califf from Caris Counseling. Mm-hmm. So we are starting a series, multi-episode series on mental health in the church. We did an event last year that we got feedback from folks that listen to the podcast, Christian leaders. Where's one way that we could really serve you and help out? And by a landslide, it was providing some connections and funding and resources for mental health and just being able to stay in the ministry, to stay in how God has called you for the long term, for yourself, for your spouse. And so that's a little bit why we're here today and wanted to meet Jamie and hear her perspective on all these things. So, yeah, Jamie, why don't you give a little background on yourself and why you wanted to get into being a therapist?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today, too. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah.
So I'm Jamie Califf. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and also the executive director at Caris Counseling. I've been there for 12 years now and just really have enjoyed my time there.
Amazing.
So getting into counseling, mostly I found myself through like young adult years being in a lot of ministry positions that had to do with leading small groups, mentoring other people my age or younger, and just feeling like I was in these situations constantly where people would come be telling me lots of deep things about their lives and feeling like I want to help them. I just feel really ill-equipped to actually know what to do.
Yeah.
And so I ended up taking like a psychology 101 class when I was in college, just as like I'll fulfill my requirement because I was going for like architecture or something like that.
Oh, cool.
And I was like, I love this. And so then I started taking more and more classes, which led to a degree in psychology from UW. And then after that, I was like, well, I guess I'll go to school for counseling.
So you moved to Portland and went to Western?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
So that was, 2010. Went to school Western Seminary. And then since then I've been working at Caris.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'll kind of kick off our conversation. How do you process through the difference between something that's like a mental health, emotional health issue versus something that's spiritual versus something that's physical? I feel like usually when you go to church and the pastoral perspective and the sermon is often, hey, here's a sin issue and God's truth addresses it and confronts us with our sin. The gospel brings hope and forgiveness for us in the midst of our sin. The Holy Spirit gives us power to overcome our sin, and often we have those conversations, but it's pretty thoroughly wrapped up in the answers that the Scriptures give, and so it feels like this like emotional health question, mental health question, like it's. There are different categories, but obviously they overlap with the kind of things that we talk about in church related to spiritual issues and physical issues. So how do you, and in my mind, it just all kind of, they overlap and it's just a bit foggy, where I find sometimes I need a physical remedy to deal with a spiritual issue. Sometimes I started this new habit here and that fixed this other like issue here. And so we're obviously complex, holistic beings, but how do you process through when you sit down with someone, this is physical, this is emotional, spiritual, mental. Well, give us some framework.
Immerse yourself in the Scripture, go for a hike, and change your diet.
Right, and all those things work together because we are multifaceted people, but also those things are very interrelated. It's like we know so much now about how much things like diet or exercise or sleep impact the brain's ability to function. And so these aren't in isolation. And we can't just sit with somebody and say, okay, we're only going to talk about the thoughts in your mind or the emotions you're experiencing, because those change and are dependent on so many other things going on in a client's life. And so depending on which like therapeutic orientation you're kind of coming from with counseling, most of them try to see people as a whole person.
Yeah.
And that includes a spiritual aspect, because even the things that you're hearing from a sermon on Sunday or what you're reading from the scriptures or experiencing in your like church communities is going to be interpreted in the context of where your brain is at that time and the relational experiences that you have. And so it's not so much, like what is the word that is being preached to you and that's going to transform you, but how is that person interpreting and receiving it?
Yeah,
and so in counseling, we think a lot, I talk a lot to my clients about using really like mindfulness or mindful awareness type perspectives that say like, let's take stock of yourself as a person here. Let's touch on all these aspects and first look at how all these interrelate, because we don't have a thought in a vacuum. And if we just work on changing our thoughts, that often doesn't change everything that came before that. And that will come downstream from those thoughts. And so mindful awareness perspective that I really like is, I use an acronym called SIFT. It's a Dan Siegel. He's written a lot of books and resources, but it's like sensations, images, feelings, thoughts is like a SIFT, right? And so I like the acronym. It's a really quick way to say, a way to check in with yourself as a whole person, to say what body sensations are you experiencing? Are you having stomach aches, headaches? Are you really overwhelmed? Are you shaky? Images, what images are going through your head? These can be like memories that are popping up, right? Or flashes of daydreams. T is for thoughts, F is for feelings, right? And so if we look at all those things together, then it also gives a context to say, where are you at right now and what can we do? And spirituality is very mixed in with that, because you'll read something and that will change your thoughts. Or you'll have a spiritual experience and that will change your emotions. And so I see these things working in tandem and just depending on how the person, where they're at, how they're experiencing it.
Now, what would you say, so in your field, right, so it's moving out of simply just, okay, here's what the scriptures say, this is a sin, or this is a promise to believe, and it's dealing with, right, mental, emotional health. How do you, as you said you study psychology and you interact with those theories and perspectives, what's the difference for you as a Christian counselor as you go in and try to help a patient that your method might be different than, let's say, a secular psychologist? How are they similar, and how are they different?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because it will look a little different depending on the client that I'm sitting with. So in some ways, the nuts and bolts of it look very much the same. So we're sitting in a room, we're doing an assessment, giving a diagnosis. That's just really to frame what our treatment plan is going to be. What are we going to do together? What kind of common goals do we have? And when I'm sitting with a client that says, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm coming to you because I want to talk about aspects of my faith, and they explicitly say, yes, let's dive into that. And I will say, awesome. What does that mean to you? Because people will come with a really different idea of what they want. And I really want to hear from my clients, like, what are their expectations and what are their hopes for their life too? And how does that interact with where they're coming from spiritually? Because I've had clients, run the spectrum and say, oh, that means for them, it's just important that I share a similar faith values and worldview perspective, so that when they talk about those things, they're not going to worry about feeling like judged or belittled for maybe where they're coming from. And maybe that's all the client wants. And the rest of it, they're like, yeah, I want to do CBT for my anxiety and work through all this. Great, let's go. But some clients are like, yeah, that means I really want you to pray with me. And that's important because it feels like if you participate in prayer with me, we're praying to the same God. And that's important to them. But honestly, actually, very rarely do I have a client request to pray with them. So I find it looks really different, and I think I do my best to try and tailor, what I can provide for the client based on kind of what they need. But fundamentally, I find that most people that want Christian counseling are mostly looking for a safe space with a person they can trust. Because a lot of studies have shown that like 80% of the effectiveness of counseling is the quality of the therapeutic reliance, right? It's just how safe is that relationship for the client coming in to just be able to think, say, and feel whatever's on their mind, whatever they're processing, whatever's on their heart, without worried about feeling like they're going to be judged or there's repercussions for them in their personal life if they said that out loud to anybody else. And that safe space actually creates the environment needed for them to heal. And so, just depending on where the client's at, really.
Yeah, that last piece, that definitely came up as we were talking to ministry leaders and what the desire was and the need for a church leader. There's this loneliness that happens. Where you're at the top and you need to be strong for your leadership team and for your congregation. And when there's challenges at home with a marriage or with your kids, there's not always a safe place where you feel like, okay, you can kind of be vulnerable and share what you're dealing with, because either you're worried about, hey, my job's at risk, or the respect that people have for me, they'll lose that respect because they know that I'm dealing with this issue. What does that look like for like a church leader to say, hey, I'm dealing with this addiction, or I have this marriage issue? What does that look like for them to find help through like Christian counseling?
Yeah. Well, depending on what are the specifics they want to focus on, like we would do our best to match them with a counselor that really specializes in that area, whether it's like marriage and family therapy, if they really want to get in and process what's going on relationally. Or if there's something going on with their kids, we'd say, okay, let's connect you with like some family therapy or like parent skill training and stuff to just dive into how can we help you feel like you are like engaging with and interacting and parenting your kids well, because there's a lot of different aspects of that. Or if it's, just being able to sit with someone through, burnout and depression and hopelessness, like all these things, chronic stress can impact that a lot too, mental health issues.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, this is a guy that is a pastor and has testified to how helpful therapy is in his life.
Yeah, definitely. And so much of what you shared so far is insightful. I think about like the counselor that I'm going to right now, and there's so much trust. It takes time to build up, but there's kind of this first impression where you're like, this is somebody that I feel I can share anything with, and it's not going to be like a reaction or and that's so important. I mean, but I also think there's a lot to that of, I feel like I have peers like within my denomination that are older pastors that are also like that I can share stuff with, but it just needs to be multifaceted, I think. I think if you are going to thrive in ministry long term, you need several like safe places to process even just things going on in your church or your own personal life that tend to bleed out into the church if you're not processing them in healthy ways. So we're all believers here. We're all Christians, and I'm sure most of the people that are listening are as well. And everyone's thought about like Christian counseling or whether they would go to a Christian counselor or a not Christian counselor or like all these things. And what when you think of Christian counseling or like counseling that is from a Christ-centered perspective, what do you think about, and what are the different schools within that?
Yeah, so historically there have been quite a few different schools of thought about this.
Okay.
And so when I was kind of taught a little bit about this in my integration classes like 10 years ago, it was kind of conceived that there's a spectrum of like biblical counseling on one side and secular counseling or psychology on the other side, that you could kind of fall somewhere in the middle, just depending on really how much you use what I would consider like a Bible first perspective. So like we're going to read the Bible, we're going to take some principles out of there, and we're going to use that to apply it onto people's lives. And that be the rubric that we're doing counseling against.
Yeah. And
then there's a people perspective side is how I would describe more the secular psychology of like, we're going to study people and behavior. We're going to, conduct studies and have like evidence-based interventions on how we go about understanding people and changing behavior, but also having a client-focused perspective as far as we're not going to try and necessarily overly define the outcome of what does a healthy, happy life look like for every person. And we're not necessarily running towards the same common goal. So they developed more, and where the field has shifted is more that if you're a licensed mental health counselor, you're doing a couple of those nuts and bolts things we talked about earlier, like you're going to use the DSM-5 to diagnose.
Yeah.
And with a lot of that is we're treating impairment in functioning. So impairment in functioning is this idea that you can have a collection of symptoms, but in order to really even be diagnosed, you have to show that it's impairing your ability to live your life in some way, like daily functioning, relationships are struggling, can't stay consistent at work, something like that. And so the goal of counseling then really is to address and help overcome those barriers and hurdles to whatever that client defines is a healthfully functioning society for them.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about Christian counselor being in that sphere, it can look different based on what counselor you're seeing. So I always recommend that when someone is looking for Christian counseling, they're doing like initial consultation call, to just ask their counselor, what does it mean for them? And to make sure that's a good match, because some counselors will say, okay, I primarily conceive of myself as I'm delivering the service to people, have that model, and I'm just a Christian individual who loves Jesus, and I'm delivering the service to people. And just my love and care for people, Jesus and the Holy Spirit fuel my grace and my compassion and my strength, and I'm outpouring that to meet people where they're at. And other counselors will have more of a Christian counseling perspective where they view integration a little differently, and they'll say, I really want to explicitly talk about and work my clients towards a model of health and healing that looks more biblical, whether that's just redemption and relationships or other issues of identity. But I would highly recommend that any person walking into that really just understands and agrees and is on the same page with what their counselor is able to offer.
Do you guys do do you usually have a 15-minute consultation with a client, or you kind of feel it, you're like getting to know each other that first session, and like, oh, like, sorry, like, you're great, but this isn't a good fit? I mean, what do you do to kind of mitigate some of those? Yeah,
so usually at our practice at Caris, we do at least 15-minute long consultation phone conversations. We try to ask some of those big questions and just also screen people before we sign them up for an intake, which can be 1 to 2 hours long. Then you already feel invested at that point, filling all the paperwork and everything. And so we want to make sure it's a really good match, even not just for Caris, but even the counselor that they're going to see, because each counselor too, has their personal set of experiences and perspectives and different levels of, training. And we want to make sure everyone feels like they have a place that is helpful and safe.
Yeah.
So over the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, I know of a handful of Christian leaders here in Portland whose marriages have blown up. Either a couple stories of a church planner where the wife is discontent somehow and actually cheats on her husband with a ministry leader in the church plant or the church, or vice versa, right? The pastor has an affair, commits adultery with another person in the church, and then the marriage goes through this whirlwind of conflict, and is it going to stay together? Is it not? How do you heal and build trust again? And so that's what makes me feel like this is an urgent issue, to see safe places for ministry leaders and their spouses and their kids to find health and find help when they need it. I wonder, do you have, can you speak to some success stories where you're like, hey, here's a ministry family, and I say that in particular because that's who our audience is, but here's a family that got help, that were genuinely on the edge or had already fallen off and found a way to restore their health in their marriage and their family, or got kind of prevention from things absolutely imploding.
Yeah, well, I can only share so much.
Oh, for sure.
HIPAA rules and all that. But yeah, I mean, I'll speak a little bit more to families in general. I do see a lot of, I tend personally in my caseload to have a lot of teens and young adults. So definitely work a lot with their parents as well, and parenting skills and other family things. And I will say it can be very difficult for children and teens to go through family disruptions like that. And so I'll probably speak more from that perspective. Yeah, and it can be hard for parents to know how do you walk your kids through that because they're watching it. Like you can do your best to hide all those things, but they know, and they read, depending on how old this child is too, they have access to the internet. They can read all the news, they can read all the stories. I've had kids that will come to session, like teens will come to session and they'll show me their phone and say, my friend texted me that my family and this picture of myself from when I was little is like on an article in the news and I had no idea. And then we're processing that in session. A feeling of like there's no anonymity anymore for them. There's all this stuff, online and on the media. Yeah. And their friends find out about it. And for kids and teens, it's hard to navigate through that because it's not any choices they made. But they're having to live with processing a lot of the fallout. But parents definitely can walk through that with their kids in a really helpful way. But it takes a lot of time and attention and a lot of like listening your kids out. So a lot of what we're doing in therapy is like helping the child or the teen like process through what big emotions do they have and what are all the things that they can think, say, and feel in the room and say to me, but it's really hard for them to feel like they can say to their parent. And then to try and help facilitate those conversations as we can. Yeah. And coaching parents to be like, there's steps to this. Yeah. If you really want to walk your kid through this, maintain relationship is often a huge goal for these families. Teaching a parent, hey, first we're just going to sit and listen to your kid, just like resist the impulse to respond. Just teaching listening skills, teaching how to find a common ground of a common goal that you both have, even if how you get there looks a little different or the child's having a very different perspective and going through a lot of their own anger or grief or processing too of the things that they've lost, even if it's just kind of an image of the family that they thought they had or they thought they would always have or that their friends had of them.
I'm reminded of when we did our Multiply PDX planning retreat. And we looked at the different ways that we could serve church leaders in the city. And the common theme of, hey, this is a need to address was just like pride and self-reliance within leaders. Yeah. Right? And we can all relate to that. But it just, as I'm hearing you share, like the type of self-isolation that leads to a serious family implosion where you're going along and you're like, okay, well, I'm managing this addiction here, or I have this unresolved conflict in my marriage, or I have this this rebellion in a child that I just kind of try to brush under the rug. And the leader, we try to self-manage and like, oh, I got this. And you hold the pieces together. I got it. Whoa, I lost it. Yeah. Right? Like, would you, and I know this is asking you to step into more of the giving overt counsel side, but can the same I got this like mentality that leads someone into serious family issues, can they get themselves out of the serious hole that they dug on their own? Or is there a genuine need for reinforcements, outside help?
It depends on the person. I mean, healing's always possible. It's just sometimes how long do you want to take to get there? How many times do you want to crash and burn? How hard have you been trying and how burned out are you? Like how much resources do you actually have left to keep throwing at that? Because over time you have like a chronic sense of fatigue and energy depletion and exhaustion. And it can take up to 2 years to come out of burnout, even if you're getting the best sleep and the stars are aligning and there's nothing else. And if you're talking about families that are raising kids, you don't often have 2 years to
no break.
You don't have 2 years to heal yourself. And the change that your child goes through just developmentally every 2 years is so huge. And so time is of the essence when you have small children, when you have teens, you don't have much time left to them. They're little. It's like their brains are developing and it's going to be set in stone really fast. So I would say if you're talking about trying to get help so that you can be a really attentive and available parent, always now. It's never too late to start, but also if you can be really intentional early on, the later years through teens are just a different experience if you have that relationship developed with your kids. already, and you're not trying to do that in the midst of this whole individuation pushing back against everything in teens, it'll be different.
Are there some like just warning signs? It's the whole like dash lights that come on. Like, what are the dash lights to look out for to say, okay, it's time for reinforcements. It's time to get serious pastoral counseling, coaching, mentorship related to family life, or just even the health of a church leader?
Yeah. Wow. That's a broad question. Because again, like, symptoms of needing help can vary person to person. And a lot of times it's knowing yourself and knowing how does stress manifest itself for you. Because we all have a bent, right? And I think of this very holistically too. Like, people have a set of genes that they inherited from their families. They have a set of early childhood experiences. We know that trauma is passed down generation to generation just in the way your genes are expressed. And so some of these things we inherit and impact how, when we're placed under stress, we try to cope with all that stuff. So for some people, it looks like alcoholism. For some people, it can look like infidelity. For some people, it can look like having severe, hopeless depression and suicidal ideation. For some people, it can look like just being angry all the time and yelling at your kids constantly because you just can't handle any more noise or irritations. And really, when you know you need help is when you're struggling to overcome those things and to function in such a way where you can show up and be the spouse that you want to be, the parent that you want to be, work in the way you want to work. And I think most people know when they're struggling. Like, they might try and hide it a little bit, but if you really ask them and they weren't afraid to tell you, most people can feel it, right? There's a drain. There's a mental drain, there's an emotional drain, there's just a wearingness and an exhaustion. And for some people that looks more physical, like they have difficulty sleeping, so like chronic insomnia. Some people talk to their doctors and get blood work done and they'll be like really low iron. They'll have just high cortisol levels constantly. So you can look for physical manifestations, but also relationally, like if your kids are struggling, they're acting out a lot in such a way that you have just large emotional behaviors going on all the time, and you're struggling to like manage and contain what's going on. If your relationship with your spouse is such where you're avoiding each other all the time, you're not talking about deep things and how you're really struggling. You get this like ships passing in the night sort of thing where, you know, there's a lot of work to do. The kids have a lot of needs. Like, everyone's just trying to keep up on the day-to-day. And things can just go unspoken and untalked about for a really long period of time. And that can start to get into trouble, just the accumulation of those things. John Gottman's research talks a lot about like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is how he puts it. Like, there's these signs you can look for
within
that
marriage,
just accumulate over time. And a lot of it's just, at the end of the day, it's built up resentment. Like, if there is a sense of, this other person's not hearing me, they're not understanding me, I almost feel a sense of contempt for them because they're feeling in ways to be there for me. And I'm also feeling frustrated and guilty because I know I'm feeling in ways to be there for them. And that goes on for long enough and it gets harder to repair because you just have an accumulation of really negative experiences that then you have to work through. So again, the sooner you can identify that for yourself or your spouse and find somebody just to start talking about it, or to even work together with a counselor to assess, where are we? Is there a problem here? Is this normal? Is this not normal? What can we do to right things now, and to have some check-ins and make sure we're on a healthy path before we get way off base? And it's hard to course correct, and it takes a lot more time and energy.
Okay, so that leads into our next question of, a lot of times people think about counseling as like where you go in a crisis, you know, like everything's blown up, and I do, depending on what church context you're in, there is sort of that like, oh, well, blah, blah, blah is going to counseling, or like, oh, one of our elders is going to counseling, you know, and I think we need to move past that as a culture of like, no, life is challenging. life is hard. Like going through like all these different stages and seasons of grief, seasons of pain. Like pastoral ministry is just really hard. And it's good. Like I used to kind of laugh when my mentor was like, every pastor should have a therapist that's like that they can call, like so when, how can therapists work with pastors and Christian leaders to form like a, healthy rhythms so that if crisis is avoidable, so how can a counselor be a resource for you to like stay healthy in your ministry, in your marriage, in your life?
Yeah, certainly. I know for myself personally and a lot of our counselors at Caris, we have like long-term clients basically, available for when life does happen unexpectedly. There's somebody to come in and talk to, whether that's for a few weeks or a few months, and then we can go to monthly check-ins or just kind of as needed based on what symptoms are popping up and whatnot. Being at Caris for 12 years, I definitely have seen clients, they're doing great, or they just kind of disappear for a while, and then like 5 years later, they'll call me up and be like, hey, I remembered I saw you before. Can I see you again? I'm like, great. And I always prioritize bringing back in clients that have been in before, because for them, the benefit, if you can find a counselor that is available like that, is still in your area, the continuity makes it so much smoother. You don't have to come in and restart an intake every single time, explain to a new person your whole life story and your background. It's like you can just kind of pick up where you left off, work through that issue. And what's been really surprising to me is, again, I'm talking more to specifically like a young adult population that I've worked with, but even for them too, like seeing a teen go through some like severe social anxiety, some depression, some self-harm, work with them for a couple of years, they're stable really well, right? Well, call me back in 3 years when they're like home on a break from college and be like, hey, like so I'm going through something with like my boyfriend, or like I'm just in this like existential crisis. Can I come in? I saw them for like 2 sessions and they're like, okay, course corrected. Good, great. I'm awesome. Let's go. And so there's this continuity sense that I think it is really beneficial. If you're going through a hard time, doing the work to get established with someone, it is a lot of work. You got to fill out this paperwork, tell them your life story, all this stuff. Develop that relationship of trust over time. But it's really invaluable because life happens really unexpectedly. Family members get sick. COVID happened unexpectedly. Some giant crisis in people's lives. Or people often don't expect how traumas or other early experiences can pop up at any time. I've had clients where I walked them through really, really difficult circumstances for years. They got through the crisis point and they're like, hey, I just need to take a break from counseling, go live my life for a little bit. It's like, okay, great. Like we got you through crisis. They went live their life for like a couple of years. Then they call me back up and are like, all right, I'm having nightmares. And all these like intrusive thoughts and physical symptoms, like emotionally when I'm around certain people. And basically they were having some PTSD type of things come back that were related to, we tried to process as much as we could in the crisis. But for them, there was only so much they can handle. They needed space and a break. And then a couple of years later, their mind and their body is telling them, you still have some unresolved stuff here. So they came back in and were making really quick progress within a few weeks, just resolving that. And for them, it's been so fast because they have the established relationship where I know all of what they walked through very intimately because we walked through that together. And they did the best they could to process that at the time, which was great. It's better than not. But sometimes you also don't know how things will impact you down the road. So
that's cool. Well, as we move forward, kind of wrapping up, we want to learn more about Caris Counseling and like what you guys do and what's kind of your mission as an organization, and share with us about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Caris has been around for a long time. It was started in 1997 by Dr. Kay Bruce, who was also the director of Western Seminary's counseling program for a long time. And so her heart at the beginning of starting Caris was seeing, especially in the 90s, there was very much in a lot of the Christian community she was a part of, kind of a mistrust of what was deemed more of a secular psychology. But there were a lot of needs that she was witnessing, and she wanted to bridge that gap to say, hey, these things can coexist. They're not a contradiction with each other. And she was concerned about sometimes over-spiritualizing mental health issues. And so she started with a few interns and herself in a church basement, and we've just grown over time.
Cool.
And for a long time, our executive director was Dr. Bart Fowler, and he's still with us as our clinical director. And so there's been a lot of continuity. And our team has grown to about 14 people now. We have 3 locations in Clark County. So we're in, we have space at North Creek Church in Vancouver, also in Ridgefield, at Ridgefield Church of the Nazarene, and in Camas. And our mission is to make counseling accessible and affordable to people, and to be a trusted source of Christian professional counseling and mental health education. So that looks like we partner with churches for low-cost use of space so that we can try to provide as much discounts or scholarships for people that don't have insurance, that need to access counseling. Because the big need in our community is making sure that people that really need help are able to get it. And sometimes it's hard to find an available counselor or someone that you can afford. So all of our staff, they have a variety of specialties. You know, we have staff that are trained in EMDR. We have some marriage and family therapists. And kind of across the gamut, we try to do our best to, you know, match people with what the needs are.
I want to have you back to talk about EMDR because I'm interested in that. And there's some folks I've been talking with about that, but
And you guys accept insurance, right?
We do,
And if someone's from Oregon, does Oregon insurance and Oregon patients can be seen by you folks too?
Yeah, most of the time, yes. So their little caveat here is that the way licensure works is we can only see Oregon clients if they come up to our business, or if the counselor they're seeing is doing teletherapy with them, also holds an Oregon license. We do have a number of our counselors that are also licensed in Oregon and in Washington. And most of the commercial health plans we work include Portland and Clark County in like the same region. So usually insurance billing is not an issue.
Great. Yeah. And are there particular resources that you guys have for ministry families or church leaders?
Yeah, well, one program that we've just launched the last year as well is called the Mental Health Education Program. And I think you guys are going to have Abe on to talk a little bit more about that. But it's a free resource where we're trying to get mental health education and training into church and faith spaces and schools free of charge. Right now it's funded by the Murdoch Trust. And so we're really excited about that being a resource to hopefully support people in the faith communities they're already a part of, and to stimulate healthy conversations around these things, and to have some help and resources. If people are looking to get connected with counseling, we have a intake form on our website, and actually we assign a counselor every week to be personally checking those, calling those people back, and have a huge referral list that if you're not a good fit for us, but you're looking for something specific, we have a lot of resources. We try to do our best to help connect people to Christian counselors or certain specialties, or some niche thing that they're looking for around the area. Because commonly we hear too, people are frustrated and they don't know where to start, or they've called like 5 different counselors from Psychology Today and left voicemails and nobody calls them back. So we try to do our best to do follow-up care and to just be a place that can be a first touch of connection for people that are really trying to investigate where do they land, how do they actually find help for the first time.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. This has been a wonderful conversation. I think really helpful to our folks, and we wish you well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.